If you haven't taken a sort of anti-anxiety med today, or you're very tense, you might not want to watch this lesson right now, because it really deals with anxiety and modernism and change that was happening in the 17 and then the 1800s and then the beginning of the 1900s. And what I'm kind of discussing is some of the ideas that are culminating in Romantic painting and Symbolist painting, the post-impressionist Paul Gauguin and the Romanticist Henry Fuseli, are both kind of painting scenes in which they're expressing supernatural forces and their impact on the so-called modern world of their time. Now, Fuseli is really kind of showing you literally a nightmare in which a woman falls asleep under the influence of laudanum, and she has this sort of night terror in which she feels she can't breathe. And in the right-hand image, we have an idea of this woman who's fallen asleep or is sort of looking over her shoulder, and the spirit of her dead ancestors are watching. Now, when Paul Gauguin went to Tahiti, I think he was really trying to flee some of the things that were happening in 19th century Europe, especially the fact that people didn't seem to be in touch with the spiritual world and with any kind of sort of basic drive and basic instinct. And in both these paintings, there's a strong supernatural element, and there seems to be death kind of looking over the shoulders of the individuals. Now, I'm not sure if it's really expressing a fear of death, but I think that there's always been memento mori kinds of paintings that have expressed this kind of idea. And so when we look at painters who are painting at the turn of the century, we have a lot of elements that lead up to these sort of feelings of anxiety and also a fear of the modern world, and there's some sort of disunification and alienation going on. Now, I'm going to start with a quote by Edvard Munch, but we're going to be looking at a painting by Gustav Klimt. And the quote says, "For as long as I can remember, I have suffered from a deep feeling of anxiety, which I have tried to express in my art. Without anxiety and illness, I should have been like a ship without a rudder." And that's Edvard Munch speaking about painting. Gustav Klimt was actually not quite the depresso that Edvard Munch was, but if you look at this painting, right off the bat, you can see that there's a conflict between this skull-like figure that represents death and this sort of river of life on the right-hand side. Now, Gustav Klimt lived in Vienna at the time of the turn of the century, and Vienna was this completely alive world. Gustav Mahler was a musician who was playing at that time. There were a lot of cultural events going on in Vienna at that time. It was really the place to be. And I think what kind of happens with him living there and seeing all of these modern conveniences being invented and railroads and the rise of cities and all of these things going on is, in a way, he's expressing some of the anxieties of the two painters we looked at just before. What I'm kind of talking about is this sort of memento mori attitude where life and death are kind of at odds with each other. And when we studied Manet, one of the things that I mentioned to you was the idea that Victoria and Albert, when they had the World's Fair, were kind of upset or a little bit bugged by the fact that there was mass manufactured fabrics and textiles, and people were combining a ton of textiles together, and they were trying to teach good taste. And in Manet's painting Olympia, he kind of shows you this sort of arbitrary combination of patterns in someone's home without really a regard to how they go together. Gustav Klimt kind of takes that to the next level, but I think that the patterns that he has in his painting really express some of the issues having to do with gender, religion, maybe even some other things that I'm not quite aware of. You have to think that factories were mass-producing textiles at this point in time. Photography had already been invented and was around for at least 50, 60 years. And here he is sort of competing in a world where he has to come up with a new vocabulary and some new ideas. So if you look at the figure on the left-hand side, Death, which is holding some kind of torch or candlestick or something like that, has crosses all over his clothing, all over his gown, which could represent religion, and it's very angular and very blocky. the river of life with these mothers and children and the flattened out forms of, sometimes it goes into modeling of the faces and things like that, but he's not really interested in chiaroscuro, and the overall composition is very flat and diagrammatic and looks almost cartoon-like. If you look at the different textiles that are being used for the different figures, they sort of represent the gender. For instance, the rounded forms often are associated with the female forms in his paintings, and the squared off forms are associated with male figures. And I think what he's trying to show you is the schism between life and death and the sort of flow of life, and in a way kind of expressing some of the ideas that I'm sure a lot of people were concerned with at that point in time, especially since war had been right around the corner and there were a lot of things going on. So death, life, and love and sex all sort of come together in his paintings, and he really expresses them in another painting. Probably this is the one that everybody knows, and everybody seems to copy this painting and do things with it, but this painting called The Kiss sort of combines a bunch of themes that we're going to see in a later artist, Edvard Munch. And what I want to do is kind of express or talk about it in several ways. So let's talk about it first in terms of the formal analysis, so we can really kind of get to the roots of some of the things that he was doing. First of all, there is no sense of space. It almost seems like it's arbitrarily placed. You can probably relate this to Byzantine art, Byzantine manuscripts, and earlier forms of art. And remember that they were looking for new vocabularies. And one of the things that we know about Klimt is that he really loved Japanese printmaking. So some of the flattening out of forms that we saw, for instance, in the Impressionists, he's taking up, and both of them are influenced by Japanese printmaking and non-European art in general. The other thing that he's doing is he's using a vocabulary of geometric forms to express different ideas throughout the painting. So the background is a sort of ground plane or a backdrop of gold leaf that has various dots and squares in it. But then when you look at the ground that the figures are kneeling on, we have a sort of flower garden arranged in front of him that is mostly circular forms and organic forms. The same thing is true of the female figure. We see circular, rounded forms that are often associated more with femininity. And the male form on the left-hand side has squared-off blocks mainly in his fabric design as well. And it's called The Kiss, but I think it's kind of interesting because in some ways, even though it's kind of a romantic painting, I think that there's a conflation, especially in the male mind, but maybe even at this point in time, between violence and sexuality. And in a way, it almost seems as if it's an assault on her, although most people would read this as a beautiful romantic painting, which this guy is basically kissing this woman. The way he's holding her and the way her head is craned back, there's almost an aggressiveness to the lovemaking that's going on in this. And I think that's part of the sort of violent feeling of the beginning of the 1900s, that it's not romantic anymore in the way that we used to think of. And I want you to also think about the fact that every new artist feels that they're seceding from the earlier periods. That's why he called himself a secessionist. Although, and I need to point out that some books put him with the Art Nouveau movement, although I don't really feel like he is. And I think that what's kind of happening is it's sort of an expression of a lot of the attitudes, either conscious or unconscious, that's going on. So to get right to a really anxious artist, I think Edvard Munch is really a very prime example of some of the early 20th century sort of crazies and late 19th century crazy anxiety that was going on, maybe based in cities, but also in the fact that mental illness, I think, is really something that becomes almost acceptable on some level to discuss, or at least some sort of anxiety and that kind of thing. You have to recall that also Sigmund Freud lived in Vienna right around the same time as Gustav Klimt, and you know, sort of psychological theory is starting to come to the fore. Edvard Munch lives in Norway, which is a really depressing place. It doesn't get a lot of sun, it's cold, that kind of thing. And I think we should start with some context about him. Without going too deeply into his biography, a lot of people in his family died, a lot of people got sick, And he had a really tumultuous love life, probably because he seems to be sort of neurotic and not able to deal with things. It also seems like he probably could have used some modern medical pharmaceuticals to sort of treat anxieties that he was having. Although, if you study him a little bit more in depth, his later paintings, when he seems to come to terms with a lot of his problems, seem to be less interesting. The quote begins with him walking across a bridge with some friends, and this is from his journal. I was walking along the road with two friends. The sun set. I felt a tinge of melancholy. Suddenly the sky became a bloody red. I stopped, leaned against the railing, dead tired. And I looked at the flaming clouds that hung like blood, and a sword over the blue-black fjord and city. My friends walked on. I stood there trembling with fright, and I felt a loud, unending scream piercing nature. Well, this is obviously some guy who has a lot of anxieties and a lot of stress and tension, and he's making a painting of this, and many versions of this painting have been made, and also some black and white versions of it. And it really is a sort of death skull face. And if you look at the sort of design or the iconography of this painting, first of all, from a formal point of view, you can see that he's almost riffing or using some of the things that Van Gogh used when he painted, sort of the counterbalancing curves, these weird oblique perspectives that are really forced and pushed. There's strong diagonals running across the picture plane. He's not interested in modeling with light and shadow. He's really just more or less interested in almost cartooning and defining the forms with outlines. Now, I think one of the other things about this is, aside from the fact that it's a cartoon expression of anxiety in a way, and I know a lot of people actually suffer from a real condition, which is a phobia when they cross bridges, and it creates a lot of anxiety for them. I think he is also close to Gauguin in the fact that he's using color for symbolism. So this next quote, I think, ties in with the formal qualities and really expresses some ideas about his color. It would be quite amusing to preach a bit to all those people who for many years now have been looking at our paintings and either laughed or shook their heads reproachfully. They do not believe that these impressions, these instant sensations, could contain even the smallest grain of sanity. So he's acknowledging that he's kind of expressing a little bit of insanity. If a tree is red or blue, or a face is blue or green, they are sure that is insanity. Well, I think that Gauguin did that in his painting, especially Sermon, Vision After the Sermon. And I think that a lot of artists are starting to use arbitrary color. And that's going to tie in with some musical movements that we're going to be discussing later on with an artist, musical composer named Arnold Schoenberg. And I'm going to culminate this lesson with some of his ideas. So aside from a sort of arbitrary use of color, I think that probably self-expression is one of the biggest things in contemporary painting, especially at the turn of the century between the 1800s and the 1900s, and now has become just sort of part and parcel of any artist's work. I mentioned to you that Munch had a sort of tumultuous love life. I'm not even sure if it was really tumultuous. I think he was just, had crushes on people and freaked out about it. But in any event, he had a relationship with the wife of his cousin. I think he called her Mrs. Heilberg, and another woman named Tula Larsen. And this painting, according to his journal, expresses some of the ideas about his anxieties about relationships. And if you read the quote, "I am dancing with my true love," which is Miss Heilberg, a memory of her, a smiling, blonde-haired woman enters who wishes to take the flower of love. But it won't allow itself to be taken. And on the other side, one can see her dressed in black, troubled by the couple dancing, rejected, as I was rejected from her. Now, some historians have said that, one of them represents his other lover, Tula Larsen, who he rejected. But I think basically, if you look at this painting, it's pretty easy to interpret a lot of the things that are going on for him in it. You have this woman who is this sort of on the left-hand side is wearing this white dress, and it's sort of curvilinear. Her form is very curved. She's reaching for that flower, or not reaching for it, as he points out. Then you have on the right-hand side a slightly more angular figure dressed in black, just kind of like life and death in a way, rather than love and hate. It's more like, the life of his love. In the center, it's probably supposed to be a self-portrait, and he's dancing, maybe with Tula Larson. He's dressed in red, and red is a sort of violent color, but can also represent blood and fecundity and fertility. But there's these wild dancers dancing behind them. And the guy on the right-hand side, who looks like he's about to take a bite out of that dancer. Maybe that's a personal interpretation of how he thought Mrs. Heiberg's husband was, but you see these dancers twirling on this lawn. And that thing that looks like a capital letter I in the back, or a lower letter I in the background, is actually the moon, and the moon's reflection on a river behind them. And one of the things, a little contextual sort of data about that time period, or about Norway in general, is night lasts forever. And when summertime comes in, it's still like very long nighttime days. And a lot of times what they'll do is they'll just, as soon as it's warm, they just open up the doors and windows, and they have like sort of 24-hour-a-day goings on, because they can go outside, and they would have parties on the lawns and try to be outside as much as possible. And I can imagine the exhaustion that comes with that kind of partying. And maybe this is a sort of memory of how it would feel to be in that kind of circumstance, and the sorts of weird hallucinatory feelings that you get when you're overexhausted. I mean, that's a possible interpretation. And then from a formal point of view, I think that you can see that Munch probably couldn't draw his way out of a paper bag, and you're going to see that in some of the other paintings we're looking at. But he also seems to sort of borrow from a modernist vocabulary of forms that he gets from, for instance, Paul Gauguin and Van Gogh. And if you think about it, both of them were kind of expressionistic, because it wasn't really about impressionism. It was really about expressing feelings about expressing their feelings, and expressing their feelings about religion as well. So I think these two paintings are a good culmination for a talk about Edvard Munch, because what I'm talking about on the left-hand side, it's kind of hard to see, but I'm going to use the cursor and point at some things. This is some red hair that's flowing over the top of this figure. This is an arm that's wrapped around a head. This is where the ear would be. This is the eye, and the nose is hidden, tucked underneath the arm here. And this is the back of the figure. And what Munch calls that is the vampire. And I think what he's really kind of showing you is sort of relates to Fuseli painting, that women are in some way vampiric creatures that are sucking the life out of him. And of course, that's his own problem. That's not true. And even when he paints the Madonna on the right-hand side, he kind of makes her something that looks like an old black and white silent film out of a horror movie. This Madonna is not a loving Madonna. She looks vampiric. And I think he's really just trying to express his own inner anxieties about relationships and about women in general. So I guess the major themes in Munch's paintings are anxiety and anxiety about romantic love. However, there are other painters who probably take it to a more general kind of point of view. Now, we know that, for instance, Munch lived in Germany for a while, and his reputation really exploded all over Germany, and people loved his paintings, and it gave a lot of people permission to do some things, and probably gave this artist, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, permission to do some of the things he's doing in terms of his painting. And what I'm talking about is, this is a painting where he is on leave from war. He's come home, there's a female figure behind him. He's also ignoring space, pictorial space in the earlier traditional sense. He's using color in a sort of arbitrary way, but he's also drawing in a fairly arbitrary, cubistic, blocked up way. And it's a kind of scary image, because one hand is a claw and the other hand is actually cut off. And he is coming home from war, and the war basically is, he's got this horrible anxiety and fear about losing his hands, losing his limbs, and not being able to paint anymore. And of course, war does mess with your head and gives you post-traumatic stress disorder. So even when he comes home to paint, the painting both in terms of the color and in terms of how he feels, expresses an awful lot of anxiety. And so what I'm kind of expressing to you is that he is trying to come up with a new vocabulary of color, almost as if he's Van Gogh or Gauguin, so it's not really that new, but he's using color arbitrarily, and he's also using it in a very garish way, and he's also not very concerned with anatomy. He's concerned with using forms to express emotion, and so hence the term expressionism. It's really an attempt to express how he feels about his situation. Now, this painting that we're looking at by Kirchner Street in Berlin, I've read various interpretations of it. For instance, the two women on the left-hand side are supposed to be prostitutes, and one interpretation I think I read in Marilyn Stockstad said something about these prostitutes are looking at this man and he's looking away in an anxious way. I don't know if that's true. You can decide for yourself if that's true, but I think some of the things that you can really see in this painting is that it's almost like he's going back to Robert Campaign's, his use of perspective, maybe even as early as Gothic paintings' use of perspective, where they're not using vanishing points and a logical system of perspective, and the whole picture plane is tilted up, and these figures seem to almost spill out towards you. I also see that he's using a lot of cubed off forms that are very almost violently painted, sort of jagged, which expresses some of the anxiety. And the faces look like masks. They look like actually face masks in a way. So what I'm kind of suggesting to you is, this is really, you ever watch a movie where they kind of express someone's feelings who's very anxious or drugged or scared? They do weird things with the color and the lenses. I think that's what Kirchner's trying to do in this painting, is he's really trying to show you his anxiety about living in the city and that kind of thing. And the colors and the arbitrary use of color really relates to some musical movements that again, I'll show you in a minute, because they're non-local colors that are used but not to express colored light the way the Impressionists did, and it's not necessarily used to make something beautiful. He's trying to really express feelings. And if you think about it, the literary movements, the musical movements, and the visual movements that are all going on at that point in time, they're tired of beautiful, they're tired of pretty. That no longer is an applicable concept. And to them, what's more beautiful is an interesting idea and something that's true and closer to pure emotional expression. I think a very good comparison of the changes that happened between the mid-1800s and the beginning of the 1900s is this Gustav Caillebotte painting against Kirchner. We've got a Parisian street. The people are detached. They're urbane. There's a sense of visual space that's very logical and very classic in a way. The color that's being painted there is meant to express what the artist is really seeing. It's a true impression of the colored light. And the sort of emotional detachment of Impressionism is really evidenced here in Caillebotte's painting. Whereas on the right-hand side, that's a pretty scary scene. And it's not really about visual realism or veracity or recording actual visual experience, but it's more about recording the expression of those feelings. So all of this sort of comes together somewhat in some of the art and some of the music from this time period. So for instance, what I wanted to do is talk to you a little bit about a film called Dr. Caligari's Cabinet. And Dr. Caligari's Cabinet was made shortly after this, I think in 1919 or 1920. And if you look at this film clip, the plot of the film is a little bit vague and very psychological and surreal, sort of like Kirchner's paintings, in which you have this sort of evil mentalist or doctor who comes to town, and he has this guy named Cesare who's stuck in a coffin, and Cesare has visions of things, and you can ask him questions. And in one instance, what he does is he tells one of the viewers that they're going to die. And the way that this thing is photographed, it's almost like it's directly lifted out of one of those German expressionist paintings. The sets are designed to look like a German expressionist painting, but not with color, obviously, because it's in black and white. And so I think that those kinds of ideas are really evidenced in this film, that the film takes a lot from the visual arts and translates it into a longer narrative. Now, one of the other ideas that I want to discuss with you is about a tradition of looking at high art and fine art, because I think each one of these artists builds on the schema of earlier artists and of art history. They really know stuff. And so we need to start by going back to actually the 16 and 1700s, with even as far back as the 1500s, with a movement called Commedia dell'arte. And Commedia dell'arte was basically a group of troubadours or comics that would walk around and do improvisational kinds of acts. And there were stock characters. And one of the stock characters was this guy named Pierre Lunaire, who was a sort of zany clown. There were others, Harlequin, there was also lovers and things like that. And I think I've discussed this in earlier videos. So there's this attitude about Commedia dell'arte that there's a tradition and that it's an improvisational act thing, and that if you're educated, you have to be able to make reference to that. So there's a musician named Arnold Schoenberg who comes up with a sort of operatic / musical expression of some of the expressionist ideas that we looked at in Kirchner's painting and in Munch's painting. Now, what I'm talking about in terms of Schoenberg, and I'll play a clip from one of his operas, is Schoenberg did this sort of crazy thing with the music, and he called it atonality. And what he did was he took a bunch of notes and he grabs them almost randomly, the way that Kirchner grabs color. And he sets them down in a 12-tone system. He calls it serialism. And so let's say you have a series of numbers 1, 2, 3, 4. And then he repeats those same numbers or tones 4, 3, 2, 1. And that's called a palindrome. A literary expression of a palindrome is the phrase, "Madam, I'm Adam." If you spell that out, it's the same both ways. And so he sets music to that. And then he also makes reference to Commedia dell'arte. And the character that he sort of writes this Sprechstimme, which just means they sort of speech the song, he writes this sort of poem, is Pierre Lunaire. And Pierrot Lunaire is basically listening to, in some of the versions, he is looking at a sort of lint or a fleck of moon on his shirt, and he's trying to brush it off, and it's freaking him out. And you can hear that it's sort of atonal, it's very random, it's pretty crazy. So listen to this. Now, a lot of people really hate this kind of music. Obviously, it's atonal, it's kind of ugly, and even the concept of what he's singing about, he's basically singing, "There's a white fleck from the moon on my shirt, and it's freaking me out." And if you compare it against the visual arts, I've got this kind of diagram. In music, the medium or tone color is the kinds of instruments that are being used, and you can relate that somewhat to color. And in music, he's grabbing a whole bunch of sort of random instruments and putting random notes and even a random texture or rhythm or tempo on top of that. And he changes the loudness and softness, which is dynamic contrast. And all of those things relate somewhat to Kirchner's painting as well. If you think about the fact that, there's a random use of color, there's a random use of texture and line and rhythm, which ordinarily would have been cohesive with perspective. Even the composition is sort of weirdly put together. All those things kind of tie together with Schoenberg's the Moonfleck. And then the final conclusion or meaning behind these things probably has more to do with sort of insanity, anxiety, and disassociation, which I think you're going to start seeing early in the 20th century with industrialization, and how people are living in cities. I think people are really having a tough time with a lot of stuff that's going on, and that there's a rise in somewhat of an understanding of the human psychology, and maybe even an understanding of insanity and anxiety.